For all its beauty and splendor, the wilderness can be a cruel teacher. The mountains of Alaska are a crucible. They test your body, your spirit, and your judgment. You'll emerge stronger or emerge humbled. These mountains aren't playgrounds, they're graveyards, packed with dreams that turned into nightmares because someone believed they were tougher than the elements. Let's venture back into the savage wilderness where survival is earned, not given. This is Outdoor Disasters. Mountain climbing in Alaska is not for the faint of heart. The peaks here do not coddle and the terrain does not forgive. It's a realm where majestic beauty is interlaced with peril, and every ascent dances with danger. Here, the mountains rule supreme, their jagged ridges and treacherous slopes commanding respect and daunting even the most skilled climbers. One mountain that can test your mettle is Mount Johnson, a lesser-known but formidable peak located in the Alaska Range. It stands at approximately 8,460 feet or 2,580 meters and is often overshadowed by its more famous neighbors like Denali, North America's highest peak. Mount Johnson is renowned for its challenging climbs and is considered a technical climb, attracting experienced mountaineers looking to test their skills against its steep, icy faces and sharp ridges. Perhaps the most famous route on Mount Johnson is the elevator shaft. This is a direct line up the steep north face that offers mixed climbing conditions with ice and rock. It's highly technical and is coveted by ice climbers for its intense conditions and the skill required to summit. Climbers attempting Mount Johnson must be prepared for harsh weather conditions typical of the Alaska Range. The area is prone to sudden storms that can bring extreme cold, high winds, and heavy snowfall. Avalanche risk is significant, especially on the more popular routes, which can accumulate considerable snowfall. To venture into these icy giants is to challenge the very limits of human endurance and bravery. In Alaska, every mountain reminds you of a harsh truth. Here, survival is a privilege, not a promise. For Jim Sweeney and Dave Nyman, their Alaska mountain climbing adventure would be chaos. Denali National Park, a magnet for extreme climbers like Nyman and Sweeney, spans 6 million acres of wilderness dotted with spectacular glaciers and rugged peaks. Sweeney, a skilled climber taught by Nyman, cherished these daring adventures, which they had undertaken for thousands of hours, teaching and learning from each other. On April 14, 1989, Sweeney, 33, and Nyman, 31, set their sights on conquering the notorious Moose's Tooth and the elevator shaft, a challenging ice couloir on Mount Johnson. After landing near Mount Dickey, they established a base camp and began tackling the lower rock section of the Moose's Tooth. However, encountering poor rock quality on the 15th, they switched gears and decided to focus on the elevator shaft instead. A day of bad weather forced them to wait it out at their base camp on the 17th. The following day, they skied towards Mount Johnson, assessing the route and avalanche risks. After spending the night back at their base camp, they returned to Mount Johnson on the 18th, this time loaded with supplies for the climb. They ascended the north side's icefall and made a high camp 200 meters up the wall for their ascent. On April 19th, an early rise at 5 a.m. saw Sweeney and Nyman ascend towards the elevator shaft, leaving their sleeping bags behind. Reaching the base by 7:30 a.m., they waited for the sun to clear the face above. The initial 3 sections were conquered swiftly, taking less than an hour. As they progressed, the climb intensified. Jim, taking the lead, moved quickly, pulling Dave up behind him. 10 meters up, he placed a picket, then ventured 15 feet or 50 feet higher. There, near a snow bulge, Jim encountered a challenging section. As Jim reached a snow bulge, looking for a firm anchor by picking his ice axe at the snow, he triggered an avalanche and was swept off the mountain. Nyman, fortunately, had anchored himself to the side of the couloir with a screw, a picket, and 2 ice tools, and withstood the ice fall, but watched his friend fall 100 feet or 30 meters below him, slamming him violently against the mountain. Reacting swiftly, Nyman secured Sweeney with ropes and rappelled down to his injured partner. Sweeney lay unconscious, his helmet cracked, blood trickling from his nose and mouth. Thankfully, all but one tool held firm during Sweeney's 30-meter fall and the resulting avalanche. Now, with roles reversed, Dave became the leader responsible for both their lives. Regaining consciousness with Nyman's touch, Sweeney was blissfully unaware of the fall. The situation was dire. with Jim suffering a fractured right hip on one of the most technical climbs in Alaska, and their location was a ticking time bomb, being vulnerable to avalanches. Dave's immediate task was to lower Jim's incapacitated form down the sheer rock face of the elevator shaft. Faced with this harsh reality, Nyman began a grueling 6-hour task, lowering Sweeney down the mountain face. Dave had to quickly find shelter. Finding a safer area on the mountain face, Dave dug into the hillside, creating a snow hole to shield them from the plummeting temperatures. But they were far from safe. They were still stranded, 5,500 feet or 1,700 meters up Mount Johnson, surrounded by avalanches, deep snow, and the fading light. Dave elevated Sweeney's legs and insulated him from the cold. The next morning, with Jim in and out of consciousness and his condition worsening, Dave made the difficult decision to seek help. The next thing I remember is that in the morning, Dave was talking to me. He's telling me he's gonna leave. I told him I don't want you to leave me, Jim said. He left Jim with instructions to light the stove if able, despite Jim's pleas not to leave him. Leaving a partner in that kind of situation, you might come back and he'll be buried or he'll be dead, Dave said. Skiing down to the glacier and then struggling 7 miles uphill to a ski hut, Dave faced a dangerous route across crevasse-ridden terrain. Upon reaching the hut after 6 hours, he found a group of skiers vacationing in the hut. He asks if they have a radio. They didn't. Disheartened, Dave understood that immediate rescue would not come today. Despite the lack of a radio, the group of skiers, including a paramedic, decided to attempt a rescue. A very concerned Dave stated, "If you don't get to him tonight, he'll probably freeze. You're clear about where he is. Are you sure you can find him?" Dave, thoroughly exhausted, was relieved and stayed behind to rest up while the skiers followed his tracks back to Jim. They stamp out a SOS sign in the snow and embarked on their trek to rescue Jim Sweeney. Meanwhile, Jim is struggling in and out of consciousness in the snow hole. Jim's condition deteriorates, haunted by delusions and the chilling cold. "I can remember my fevered brow in the snow and still being warm, but my body is freezing. I can remember that feeling. Black dreams, just as black as can be. I didn't know who I was with, where I was at. I didn't even know I was a climber," Jim recalled. The following morning, Dave sets out to locate the rescue team. They were already ascending the glacier, pulling a sled behind them. Dave's spirits soared with relief. They were returning, and they had Jim with them. However, his relief quickly turned to dismay when he realized Jim wasn't with them. Suddenly anxious, Dave questioned, "Where's Jim? Didn't you find him?" The rescuers explained that they had made it to the base of the elevator shaft, but had to turn back. They witnessed several avalanches and, lacking the proper equipment, deemed it too risky to continue. The danger of causing additional casualties was too high. Dave struggled to contain his frustration and disbelief as he geared up to venture back up the mountain to rescue his friend. "Can anyone join me to go back up?" he pleaded. "It's too risky, you could die," they cautioned him. "I could feel them looking at me when I was skiing because I was putting any anger I had right into my plan to save Jim," Nyman recalled. The situation was desperate. The clock was ticking every second 8 miles away, and Jim was overwhelmed by avalanches. Dave, worried frantically about his partner, managed to race down the glacier and in just 6.5 hours reached their base camp to gather the necessary gear. Dave then returned to Mount Johnson, to the snow hole where he had left Jim 30 hours earlier. Upon arriving, Dave had trouble locating Jim. Dave heard what he described as the most beautiful sound, the muffled voice of Jim, who, despite being buried in a snowslide, was unexpectedly cheerful given his predicament. Overcome with emotion, Dave began to cry, a mix of helplessness and resilience battling within him. Meanwhile, Mark Nivers and his wife Roberta were flying over the Ruth Glacier, searching for a spot to land for a romantic picnic to celebrate their anniversary at the location where Mark had proposed. They planned to spend a couple of hours enjoying lunch and taking in the stunning vistas of the area. However, as they approached, Mark noticed the worsening weather and suggested that they should not land and instead return home. From below, Jim heard the airplane and, hoping for rescue, believed they would see the SOS signal and come to their aid. At the same time, Mark was prepared to attempt a landing in response to the visible SOS, but Roberta, who was 7 months pregnant, was understandably anxious and urged against landing. Understanding the responsibility of aiding someone in need, He disregards her plea and attempts to land in poor visibility. Uncertain whether he was 3 feet or 30 feet above the snow, and with the engine not performing well due to the thin air at altitude, Mark attempted to abort the landing. Despite his efforts, the plane suddenly dropped from the sky. Miraculously, they survived the crash but were 8 miles away from Dave and Jim. Their efforts to assist have unfortunately complicated the situation further. Luckily, the ski hut provides nearby shelter, the same hut where Dave had sought help from the skiers. As they stumbled into the ski hut, the skier assisted Mark with Roberta as he told them their plane just crashed. Amidst the crisis, there is a glimmer of relief as the baby is still moving, although Roberta has suffered 2 ruptured discs in her back. When Mark mentioned the SOS he spotted, he asked if they needed assistance. "No, sit down, it's a long story," one of the skiers said. Mark soon learns about Jim's climbing accident and Dave's relentless efforts to save him. Reflecting on their plight, Mark says, "I'm thinking of those guys. The snow is falling, the wind is blowing, and they're somewhere on a mountain in conditions we can only guess at." As night fell, Dave and Jim braced themselves for another night on the mountain. The sound of large snowflakes pelting the tent underscored their isolation in the wilderness. Approaching midnight, the ominous rumble of avalanches began to fill the air. Suddenly, the roar of what sounded like jet engines intensified. The avalanche-driven winds, reaching hurricane strength, enveloped their precarious shelter. "It's like sitting right under a 747. It's louder than a Pink Floyd concert. It's louder than any noise I've ever heard, and it's right above us," Jim said. In the tent, the reality of their perilous situation was palpable. Feeling utterly helpless and surrounded by the relentless avalanche, they started praying fervently. With each prayer, they faced wind blasts at over 100 miles or 160 kilometers per hour and a barrage of snow, fearing the end was near. Yet, despite their fears and the continuous assault of the elements, the catastrophic avalanche they dreaded never arrived. The next morning, Dave and Jim are still astonished that they survived that perilous night. Jim, determined not to spend another night on the mountain, insists they move. "Okay, Dave, I'm ready to go. Let's go. We can't just stay here. We're sitting ducks. You've got to help me out. We can make it down to the glacier where someone might see us." Dave counters, observing the steep terrain. "I don't think I can do it. Even if we try to cut across, we could trigger an avalanche." Frustrated, Jim protests as Dave looks for a safer spot, scanning the valley. "There is no safe spot in this whole valley," Jim retorts. "We just got to get out of here." Despite Jim's doubts, Dave moves him to a new location using a bivy sack. Once the tent is set up in the new spot, Dave reassures him everything will be okay and rescue will come. Jim snaps back. An intense back and forth ensues with the two friends, with Dave standing his ground, insisting that for Jim to live, they must wait it out. Meanwhile, back at the ski hut, Mark Nivers attempts to contact rescue via airplane radio, with no luck. Being in such a remote spot and surrounded by the mountains, their only chance is a passing airplane, which none are in the air. They're no closer to alerting a rescue party. The food supply is running low, and his pregnant wife is now starting to deteriorate. It's been 6 days stuck on the mountain, and the situation is getting dire for everyone. At the same time, Sweeney and Nyman marked their 6th night on the mountain, and the snow continued to fall heavily. Jim and Dave have found refuge in what Dave considers a relatively sheltered spot, expecting only minor blasts compared to the previous night's ordeal. Dave feels vindicated by his choice, confident they are in a safe place. However, early, around 2 a.m., they are startled by a roaring sound. "What the hell is that, Dave?" Jim asks, just before a terrifying cracking and rumbling sound, followed by explosive noises. Suddenly, they find themselves hurtling downhill. Mark Nivers, holding onto a single thread of hope, makes the trek back to the airplane. This morning, the jet that transports him to the Alaskan oil fields will fly directly overhead. It represents their best, perhaps only chance to communicate their location, confident they'll be attentive to emergency signals. He radios, "Mayday, mayday, mayday." "Hello, Mark, is that you?" "Over," comes a reply. Unfortunately, they cannot hear Mark, but can detect the clicks on his radio. They establish a code. 1 click for yes, 2 clicks for no. After 7 days, Mark's situation is known. but a rescue operation remains on hold until the weather improves and no one knows whether Jim and Dave are still alive. The avalanche plunged the duo 300 feet or 90 meters down the mountain. Miraculously, Dave and Jim survived the assault. "Are you okay, Jim?" Dave yells out. They were completely buried, and Jim's injured hip was in excruciating pain. Dave was able to get himself out, and then he pulled Jim out of the snow. But their peril was not over as avalanches roared around them. "I'm just laying there. The avalanches are roaring everywhere. It's just bad. It's war. We're just lying out there with nothing," Jim recalled. Dave was luckily able to recover the shovel and proceed to dig a cave while Jim frantically urged him to dig, fearing that the next avalanche would come and sweep them down the mountain. With great determination, Dave digs out enough space and the duo is relatively safe inside the cave. However, the situation seems insurmountable as Mount Johnson is throwing everything at them, determined not to let Dave Nyman and Jim Sweeney live. Dave Nyman was defeated and exhausted from the avalanches the night before. Jim knew he had to do something to snap Dave out of this trance. Although frustrated, he knew he couldn't afford to berate Dave. He needed to cooperate with him. Dave knew that if he left now, he wouldn't return. It was a moment of self-reflection, weighing what truly mattered to him and whether his life was worth more than Jim's. Trying to lighten the mood, Jim made an offer. "Get me off this mountain and I'll buy you the biggest, juiciest steak you've ever had at the Double Muskie." Dave counters, "I want a 36-ounce filet mignon." This decision not to abandon Jim was a critical turning point for Nyman and marked the beginning of their arduous journey to descend Mount Johnson. He started by shoveling a trail and packing it down before going back to pull Dave. Jim encouraged Dave the whole way through, noting his unprecedented focus and determination. Inch by inch, foot by foot, they slowly made their way down the mountain. However, after 17 hours, they had only traveled less than half a mile toward the glacier. Suddenly, their situation took a perilous turn as they were hit by another avalanche. They began sliding downhill uncontrollably. "This is it," Dave thought as they freefalled down a crevasse. Jim luckily fell onto a ledge 30 feet down from the opening. Dave, on the other hand, had been swept deeper into a 500-foot crevasse, barely avoiding a fatal plunge. To his relief, he could hear Jim yelling at the top of his lungs. "I start screaming at God. I'm telling him I can take more, I can take more." When Dave reached Jim, he was relieved to see his friend. They were amazed to see an escape. A steep, nearly 70-degree incline to the crevasse opening. Despite lacking an ice axe, they worked together to ascend the ramp. Their movements were painstakingly slow, moving just a foot at a time, sometimes only 4 inches per pull. Emerging from the crevasse, they laughed with relief. Jim Sweeney and Dave Nyman survived yet again. "Dave, there's the glacier. Let's just go for it. Let's toboggan down right now," Jim suggested, feeling invincible. "No way. It's too steep and full of crevasses," Dave cautioned. But nothing felt impossible to Jim now. Speeding uncontrollably down the gorge, Jim and Dave are in another precarious situation. Hours later, Dave and Jim awakened from being knocked out from the fall down the mountain. Jim and Dave had finally reached a spot on the glacier visible enough for rescue, though it seemed almost too late. Starvation loomed as Jim had consumed only a few tablespoons of food and minimal water all week. Jim felt he was going to die soon. Then a small red dot appeared on the glacier, an airplane. A break in the clouds offered a chance for rescue, filling him with overwhelming relief and prompting tears at the realization they were going to survive. The plane circled above, dipping its wings, indicating they had been spotted. While Dave is crying tears of joy, Jim, being the person he is, instructs Dave, "Get your act together. Don't cry. Stand up. You're a hero." "You don't want to be blubbering when the helicopter comes," Jim laughingly chimes back. "Shut up, Jim." Alerted by Mark's radio call, planes had been searching above the clouds until this sudden clearing allowed them a few precious minutes of sunlight, which ultimately saved everyone involved, including the Nivers, back at the hut. Later, Chinook helicopters from Fort Wainwright in Talkeetna picked up everyone, including from the ski hut, the skiers, and the Nivers, and transported them to Talkeetna. Sweeney and Nyman were transferred to a Chinook helicopter and flown from Talkeetna to Providence Hospital in Anchorage. Upon landing at the hospital, the scene was jubilant, with friends and family relieved to see their loved ones. Jim Sweeney was admitted and underwent surgery for a fractured hip. In typical Jim fashion, he didn't wallow in his current circumstance. "I smoke dope the whole time I'm in the hospital. My buddies show up with a bunch of beer. It's like a party every day in my room." Jim never fully recovered from his hip injury. It didn't stop him climbing. 8 weeks later, Roberta Nivers gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The decision not to carry a radio for all involved turned a potentially simple rescue into a major life and death ordeal for two experienced climbers. If it had not been for Mark Nivers' rescue attempt, it was very likely they would not have made it. Nevertheless, Dave Nyman and Jim Sweeney showed great determination in the self-rescue under incredibly harsh conditions. Their experience, cool-headed competence, strong will to live, and a lot of luck saved their lives. Dave Nyman was examined and released, suffering only superficial frostbite on one finger. Dave is now a father and doesn't climb as much anymore. Dave was awarded the Carnegie Medal for bravery for the rescue of his friend. In the unyielding Alaskan mountains, the real test of courage and friendship is not in the climb, but in the will to save a life amidst nature's formidable wrath. Here, each step is a battle against the odds, and every breath is a conquest over the howling winds. It is in these moments that the essence of the human spirit shines bright. The climb is treacherous, the risks immense, but the thought of leaving a friend behind is unfathomable. In the face of overwhelming danger, it is love that becomes the climber's greatest ally, transforming daunting obstacles into surmountable challenges. As the mountain tests your limits, remember why you started? Not for the summit, but for the friend whose life hangs in the balance. The journey may push you to the brink, but it is in such trials that the depth of your bonds is forged. When despair tells you to let go and save yourself, let your heart answer with resilience, let your spirit roar with defiance, and let your actions affirm the unspoken oath that no hardship can ever outweigh the value of a friend's life. Push forward, not because the mountain permits it, but because the love you harbor leaves no room for retreat. And when you finally descend with your friend safe by your side, know that this ordeal was not just a testament to survival, but a profound declaration of friendship's unyielding power that can make it through an outdoor disaster. Thank you for watching. Want more outdoor disaster content? Check out these stories I believe you'll enjoy.